Okay, so this is the question from June 2018, but you'll get a very similar question in your paper, and it will say study sources B and C, and it will show you two sources like that, and you have a source booklet, and the question will be phrased exactly the same. How useful are sources B and C to an historian studying, in this case, Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe after 1945? Okay, so we know the question is about how the Soviets dominated Eastern Europe after the Second World War. And then it says, explain your answer using B and C and your contextual knowledge. Okay, so this is a classic sort. You're going to have to employ all of the sort of source skills we've talked about over the years. Okay, so you've got two sources. Here they are. The first one, and is often the case, you may have a political cartoon, something like this. So let's have a look. Where's this from? Well, it's French, and I always like to, as you're reading it, underline the things that you think might be important. It's a French poster. It's produced in 1950, and it's commenting on Soviet expansion. It shows Stalin, and so look, we can draw a little line so we know who it is. Stalin as a dancer, accompanied by the leaders of the French Communist Party as musicians. So just a reminder, that must be those guys. The poster was produced by Peace and Liberty, an organisation supported by American finance. Now those things I hope immediately are starting to jump out as us as probably going to be important things to consider in the provenance. Okay. The second one is down here, and this is a little written document, and it says an extract from an official booklet distributed throughout the country in 1950 again by the East German Communist government. So I'm beginning to see one is produced by communists, the other is produced by supporters of the Americans. So obviously what's jumping out at me immediately is they're both going to give me some different perspectives, aren't they? So and usually with a source question like this, you're going to have two different perspectives, and so that should jump out at you. Right, let's have a look at what they actually tell us, first of all. Well, the first one in this cartoon, what's it telling us about Soviet expansion? Because that's the question. What is it telling me? Well, the first thing is, I think it's a rather negative portrayal of Stalin. Okay, why do I think it's negative? Well, it looks like he's got some sort of blade on him there, or weapon, and to my money, he's throwing those blades into Eastern European countries, isn't he? Or countries, particularly Eastern European countries, okay? And if you're throwing a blade into something, you're trying to kill it, aren't you? So this is a very negative portrayal of Stalin and his actions after the Second World War. It suggests that he is trying to murder these countries in some way. And more than that, it seems that he's supported in his actions by local communists. Right, in this case, French communists. Okay, that's the first one. Now, what's the second one telling me? The second one is telling me I would expect it to be more positive. You would as well, wouldn't you? Because you know it's coming from a communist government. It says, we East Germans need friendship with other countries to help us benefit from the massive changes in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union has transformed Poland, where landlords and industrialists are no longer in charge, but farmers and workers are instead. Poland owes its freedom and recovery to the Soviet Union. We can enjoy the same benefits. Hopefully, if the first one strikes you as negative, the second one should strike you as a very positive impact of Soviet expansion. All right? And usually the examiners, I couldn't say for certain, but probably I would say they're going to give you two different perspectives in these sources. So what have you got to do in this question? Well, the first thing, as ever, is a quick summary as to what each one is telling you. So that's easy. I'm not going to go over that again. But the first one, you just need to compare the two. Compare what they say. And that would be, the first one is a very negative impact of the expansion, whereas the second one is a much more positive impact. You'll pick up marks just for recognising that they're very different. Now, in a how useful question, doesn't particularly matter what order they come in, but let's just say for the sake of argument, let's then look at the provenance. Okay, so we're looking up at this bit and you know where this source comes from, who said it, what their motivation was. Well, we know that source B was French, and you should know, shouldn't you? And not only was it French, but it was supported by US money. And we know, don't we, that the French government was, during this period, was pro-America. And we can say that because it was a member of NATO, for example, by this point. And because it was supported by American finance, we can say that that's why this is giving us an anti-communist propaganda message, isn't it? So in that sense, it's helping us give that it's helping us understand the propaganda that existed. But it's a subjective source, isn't it? It's not balanced. If we look at the same for C, we've got exactly the same problem there, haven't we? But in this case, it's in East German. It comes from the East German government, and we know that they were under a lot of control from Stalin because of, you know, Cominform, etc., and Comecon. So we know that East Germany is controlled by Stalin largely, so again it's giving propaganda. Both of these are useful in that they help us to understand the propaganda that existed at the time, either for and against Soviet expansion. All right? Now, what's the third thing we might want to think about? Well, the third thing is, what's it actually telling us? Do we think this is true? How useful is it comparing it to our own knowledge? So if I look at this, what do I know about these things? Well, actually, there is some truth in it, isn't there? Because we know Stalin used fear and force in Eastern Europe. E.g., I could give an example, he rigged elections to ensure that communist parties remained in power there. If we're looking at source C, he talks here about the Soviet Union has transformed Poland. Well, now this one I'm slightly less sure about if I'm using my knowledge at the time. Was Poland transformed? Well, it probably did improve in the sense that, you know, after the war, it would have been devastated by bombing. So yes, to an extent that's true. But we also know, don't we, it's not entirely true because actually Stalin used Eastern European countries for his own benefit, particularly through these organisations. So I'm not quite sure how true that one is. So I've said what they tell me, I've looked at the provenance and I've discussed how truthful, how trustworthy they are. I've looked at the content, I've thought about how much I think they're true. And then finally I'm just going to say something along the lines of, well, which do I think, how are they both useful? I think they're both useful in terms of they help us to understand the propaganda, government propaganda that existed in response to the USSR in Europe. Okay, so in that sense they're quite useful for understanding what the propaganda. In terms of how truthful they are, well, we then have to take them with a bit of a pinch of salt, don't we? Because of the nature of propaganda. But I would say probably it's more, you know, of the two in terms of the content. It would be fair to say that B is perhaps closer to some sort of truth than C. Okay, because here, of course, in France, there's more freedom of speech, and we do know that Stalin did use underhand methods to ensure communism dominated those countries. Okay, and that's broadly what you're doing with that kind of question. Now, I've planned it in sort of minute detail, and I've gone through those 4 stages, but those are the stages you want to think about when you plan one of these questions. And it's taken me quite a long time to plan that, and I wouldn't necessarily expect you to do that because you'd probably want to spend about 15 minutes in total. But if you think about that process, you will find those sorts of questions easier to actually write.